I'm Sarah Wilson and you're listening to the Roots and All podcast. I'm here to help you get growing. Join me as I explore everything plant related both indoors and out and provide the information you need to create your perfect green environment. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm talking to Dr. Jack Hunter, anthropologist and author of the book Greening the Paranormal, Exploring the Ecology of Extraordinary. The book isn't about fairies at the bottom of the garden, although they do get a mention in the episode, but it looks more at ways for studying and engaging with the supernatural and considers how these might be useful when approaching the environmental crisis. I begin by asking Dr. Hunter about what his work entails.
Okay, so I'm an anthropologist by training. So my background is in anthropology. I did a PhD in social anthropology at the University of Bristol. And my research for my PhD was all about spirit mediums in Bristol. So I found this small group of people who had developed trance and physical mediumship. And I spent a lot of time with them going to seances, interviewing them, and trying to find out what it was that motivated them to dedicate days of their lives over weeks and months and years to developing mediumship, which, from the mainstream materialist perspective, is an illusion, at best, or, fraudulent at worst. But these people were, genuine people. They were doing it out of their own desire to learn about their minds and to think about spirituality and all that kind of stuff. And I had some interesting experiences myself, which I might talk about a little bit later on. So basically, the gist of my research and writing has been, how can we talk about these kinds of, paranormal experiences, extraordinary experiences, religious experiences and things like that without trying to break them down or reduce them to an explanation that kind of takes away from something of the quality of those kind of experiences. Because when people have those experiences, they're profound, transformative, kinds of events, major parts of people's lives. And the mainstream approach has basically been to say that, those kinds of experiences are basically illusory, that they are, the product of, cognitive misfirings or whatever, or psychopathology. And my approach is to say, well, maybe that's the case in some circumstances, but there's a whole load of other interesting things going on around these issues that need to be taken into consideration. So I draw on parapsychology and all of that kind of stuff. And my most recent book has been focusing on the link between these extraordinary experiences and ecology, and sort of thinking about the motivations behind people who are engaged in environmental activism, permaculture and gardening and that kind of thing, and trying to understand what the relationship is between these experiences and people's desire to engage with the natural world.
Yeah. I suppose this is probably quite subjective, but again, before we go any further, it might be worth if you could just define what is a paranormal event.
Yeah. There's lots of different ways that people define paranormal events. But I think, if we take the word, we do a sort of like an etymological breakdown of the word and think about where it comes from. It actually comes from the work of a pioneering psychologist and paranormal researcher called Frederick Myers in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he came up with this term supernormal. And the idea was that, when we think about these like events like miracles and things, they're usually put into a sort of a religious framework. And Myers wanted to put these kind of extraordinary experiences into a scientific framework. So he came up with this term supernormal to kind of bring these experiences out of the religious kind of register and into a scientific conversation. And his definition of supernormal was basically any kind of experience or event that isn't explained by current science. Okay, so, for Myers and people in the 1800s, they were talking about things like ghost sightings and mediumship and all that kind of stuff. And they felt that, and I think this is probably still true today, that science doesn't have a good enough grasp on those kind of things. So we could think about a paranormal event in those terms. It's a kind of experience that doesn't seem to have an explanation in our current scientific terms. But other people have also taken a more kind of like suppose you could call it like a phenomenological approach to defining what the paranormal is. And they say that, paranormal is a kind of event when the distinction between the subjective and objective worlds breaks down. So we might have meaningful experiences, like we might see something out in the physical world that has a direct relevance to our interior world. It's kind of like the Jungian idea of synchronicities and that kind of thing. So we can think about the paranormal in lots of different ways, basically. Perhaps it's a breakdown of the subjective and the objective, or perhaps it's an event that doesn't have a scientific explanation. But yeah.
Obviously, for the book that you've just written, you're looking at paranormal events that happen outdoors. And I did wonder, is that a more common occurrence globally than paranormal events that happen indoors?
That's a good question. I think there is a lot of sort of evidence and a lot of writing in the academic literature about mystical experiences and those kind of things to suggest that, there's something about being immersed in natural systems that leads us into these kinds of extraordinary experiences. I'm not entirely sure what that thing is. Some people have suggested that it's sort of like, how we go out into nature and it kind of relaxes us and those kind of things. Walking into woodlands reduces our blood pressure and those kind of things. So maybe allowing us to kind of relax and enter into more kind of like flow states of consciousness and that kind of thing could be something to do with it. It could also be something to do with there being like, things out there in the environment that have an impact on us. So people like Paul Devereux have talked about, radiation and background electromagnetism and those kind of things that might be present in certain areas of the landscape. And that when human beings go into those places, these electromagnetic fields might interact with our brains in certain ways and give rise to various kinds of extraordinary experiences. So, that's another possibility, that there is actually something in the landscape that causes these experiences. And then we could even take it out, further into like an animistic idea that when we go out into the world, into forests and wilderness, that we are entering into a space that is occupied by lots of different kinds of animals and plants, and that perhaps, something to do with that kind of engagement is why these experiences arise in the natural world. This idea about indoor and outdoor experiences as well. I've been thinking about this. And actually, you think about indoor spaces, there isn't really any, we have walls and those kind of things. Walls are permeable. I live in the countryside and we have, frogs and things coming into the house, spiders and things coming in. So, indoor and outdoor experiences, is there really that much of a difference between them? In ecologically thinking, the same air flows through the house and it goes outside and comes in. All of these different things are cycling in and out of the home. So even when we're inside, we're still connected to wider systems.
Yeah, that's very true. Because I was thinking, actually there is a big distinction between the indoor and the outdoor worlds. And then would that be a totally different type of experience? But as you say, actually no, because everything is flowing together. And it's interesting that you mentioned Paul Devereux, because I wondered if you could start by giving an overview of what animism is. But then also he goes on to say in his essay in the book that he thinks that accepting animism in the modern world is, in quotes, a bridge too far. And I just wondered what you've thought about that. Are we that far removed that we can't even understand that concept?
Yeah. Okay. Well, animism, it's an academic term again. It comes from anthropology. It comes from the writings of a guy called E.B. Tylor, who lots of people hold up as kind of like one of the founding fathers of anthropology. And he looked at different religious traditions around the world, different cultures and societies, mostly based on the reports of, explorers and missionaries and things. And he identified within them this kind of what he thought of as like a common belief amongst pretty much all human beings or all human cultures in the existence of spiritual beings, the belief in spirits. And he thought that, you could go to the most, in using Victorian terminology, primitive tribes, or up to like, Catholicism and the world religions, and regardless of what kind of society you were looking at, you would find some form of animism taking place in there. So the world religions are just an extension of this primitive animism. But Tylor's ideas about animism were also bound up with, lots of things that were prevalent at the time, cultural ideas to do with social evolution and that kind of thing, where European societies viewed as the kind of the dominant societies that had, they'd evolved to a higher state than, non-Western societies. So the idea of animism kind of became pejorative. It was like it's a bad thing if you were an animist because it meant that you were primitive and all those kind of things. And it wasn't until the 1960s, with the work of people like Irving Hallowell, who did research with the Ojibwa people in Canada, and then later people like Graham Harvey, who looked at animism through different eyes, and they realized animism is not necessarily, although spirits are involved, it's not necessarily defined by the belief in spiritual beings. Actually, what animism is defined by is an understanding of the world as consisting of relationships between persons. And they point out that, not all persons are necessarily human persons. So let's take, for example, the Ojibwa worldview that was described by Irving Hallowell. In the Ojibwa worldview, the idea of persons can apply to, human beings, but also to plants, animals, and rocks and those kinds of things. Okay, so from this new reframing of animism as a relationship between persons, maybe we can move towards, if we can incorporate some of these ideas into our culture in some way, that we can move towards a more kind of harmonious and balanced relationship with the other kinds of animals and plants that are inhabiting the environment with us. But you're right, Paul Devereux says that for some, accepting the possibility that there might be, other kinds of minds and spirits in the environment might be a step too far. But I would point out that, this tendency to see the world as being inspirited or, as having personhood and those kinds of things is actually fundamental to, human development. I was only reading the other day about, animism in childhood and how, young children go through these various phases of their cognitive development, but the early phases often involve an animistic view of the world, and children will talk to, trees and rocks and those kinds of things. So in that sense, although like from a mainstream perspective, animism is viewed as something that is, associated with spirits and all that kind of stuff and is pushed to the side, actually for a lot of people, it's also an innate kind of way of interacting with the world. I was talking to some old people the other day that I was working with. We were making a fence, and they were talking about, we were chopping down a few trees to make these fences, and we were walking through the woods looking for the right kind of thickness trees and things. And these old guys were referring to the trees as him, let's say, or he over there, he looks like a good one, we'll take him. So I think actually a lot of people are already engaging in a kind of animistic way of thinking about the world, even if they're not necessarily aware of it. So it might be a step too far for some, but it also, a lot of people might be animists and not even be aware of it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I've probably read I think it was Charles Eisenstein's book, that we get that thumped out of us. Actually, we get ridiculed for doing it. So it does come naturally, but it's something that's maybe, forced out of us. But I have to ask the question that I'm sure you get asked all the time, which is, Have you had a paranormal experience in the outdoors yourself?
Yeah. It's interesting because some of my most potent kind of experiences that I had during my field work, which, as I said, was on spirit mediumship. And at the time, I didn't think much of it, but actually, the groups that I was working with, all of their seances and the rituals that I attended took place outside in the garden shed. That was where they had their seance lodge. And obviously, I wasn't thinking at the time, this is like, 10 years ago now, I wasn't thinking in terms of ecology and all of that kind of stuff at the time. I was thinking in terms of, why do people believe in spirits and that kind of thing. But now looking back to it, I realize, all of these activities took place in the garden. We would walk through the garden to get to the seance room. So it separated, the garden became kind of like, a bridge or a walkway between, inside the house, which is where we were talking and having tea and all of that kind of stuff, walk through the garden into the seance room, and that's where we would have, communication with the spirits and those kind of things. And actually, when you look at these things historically, you see that a lot of ancient societies ancient Greeks, in ancient Egypt and Babylon, places like that, gardens were understood as kind of like, I've read somewhere them being described as antechambers to the netherworld. That the garden itself was a place where you would go to have interactions with spiritual beings. I read another interesting paper recently about the Aguaruna Jivaro people in Peru, and they have this form of gardening that is the domain of women. Okay, so the women do the gardening, but there's all sorts of different magical rituals that women have to perform in gardens in order to keep themselves safe, because gardens are kind of like a halfway point between the human world and the spirit world. So or you could think about it as halfway between the human world and the natural world. So it's a place where dangerous things can happen. And they have all of these magical rituals and special kinds of like rocks and things that they bring into the garden for protection, because the garden is this kind of like, some people have called it like a hybrid place, a place halfway between the spirit world and the human world. And we also have this idea of fairies at the bottom of the garden, don't we?
Yeah.
Tell your kids to go down to the bottom of the garden to find fairies if you want like 10 minutes peace. But I think there's a deeper thing running there, because the bottom of the garden is where the human world ebbs away and it becomes increasingly wild. There might be a patch of nettles down at the bottom of the garden or something like that, but it's the wilderness space in the garden.
Yeah.
And according to our folklore and things, that's where you go to have interactions with fairies and other than human consciousness.
Yeah, that's so true. And it puts me in mind of the Japanese tea houses as well, where you kind of go through the process of moving through the garden, even if it's a very small one. Yeah, interesting. So I think a lot of humans nowadays feel quite separate from their ecosystems. And when I was reading the book, what struck me is, do you think there are any other species that are so disconnected from their own ecosystems? And if not, why? What makes us different as humans? What allows us to almost kind of turn our backs on our natural connections and just think that we're so apart from them?
I think that the problem is mostly a cultural problem. It's to do with dominant cultures. So, in the Western world, our dominant culture, although there are lots of obviously subcultures and other traditions as well, and there are also parallel traditions within Western culture, Western esotericism and all of that kind of stuff. But the dominant Western culture is broadly like a materialist scientific worldview. It's the kind of worldview that we are brought up into, in our schools and things like that. And it's based on, principles of pretty much like a Newtonian kind of worldview, where everything is viewed as discrete entities. Humans are seen as individuals, that we're separated from each other by the sheath of our skin, basically. And we're separated from the natural world. We build houses, we were talking about this before, to kind of like separate ourselves from the world, even if it doesn't necessarily work. But, we move indoors and think of ourselves, we do indoor activities and then outdoor activities. So our culture has built up this kind of, kind of like a dichotomy. It's kind of like a self-other dichotomy, that the self is us, and then outside of us, everything else is disconnected from us. It's not us. And I think that's where this problem comes from. But I think it's a particularly Western kind of problem. If we go to talk to people in the Amazon rainforest, for example, their whole worldview and cosmology is we might even consider it an eco-philosophy, an eco worldview, that it's part of the ecosystem. They haven't tried to, their culture doesn't make a separation between the self and the natural world, and our culture does. And I think, our Western culture does. And I think that's the main problem here.
The other thing that I found really interesting in the book actually was, again, I suppose going back to the idea of actually interacting with nature and getting involved in it and actually thinking about yourself as part of the system, was that you found a really interesting correlation between people who interact with the natural world and people having extraordinary experiences. And I wondered what came first. Is it the fact that people are involved in the natural world and therefore they're having these experiences, or do these experiences lead to them then to to connect further with the natural world, or is it maybe a bit of both?
Yeah, I think what I found was, what I found a few little pointers. Basically, I did a preliminary survey of permaculture practitioners, asking about the paranormal, extraordinary experiences, and that kind of thing. It was only a very rough survey, and the data that I got was, fairly limited. But I think the idea is that, it's a step that, someone else can build on at some point. And what I found was that quite a few people in the permaculture community, first of all, an interesting point was that they were quite averse to the idea of the paranormal. Some of them were, and they didn't see any connection between what I was interested in, extraordinary experiences and the paranormal. So some people, would fill in my questionnaire, kind of like as a joke, which is fair enough. But other people saw that there was a deep connection between permaculture and extraordinary experiences, or permaculture and spirituality. And part of the reason they thought that was because permaculture provides them with this kind of like a philosophy of interconnectedness, basically. And they can see then how concepts like spirituality and their experiences might relate into that, feed into it as an interconnected system. So when I did this interview, some people said that they had through participating in permaculture gardens, through engaging with their gardens and interacting with the plants and animals in their gardens, that they'd had experiences of maybe like communication with the plants in some way, like a non-ordinary kind of communication. They might have heard a voice of the plants or something like that. Basically, those kinds of experiences that give people a sense that they are connected with the world, that they can have like a personal relationship with the tree, for instance. But it seems to me to be a feedback loop. So that actually, you have to engage with nature in order to have the extraordinary experiences. And then the extraordinary experiences kind of encourage us to re-engage with nature. But we also see in other kinds of extraordinary experiences, like even alien abductions, for example, that people come back from these experiences with an enhanced sense of connection to the natural world. The psychiatrist John Mack, who did this study of alien abductions in the 80s and 90s, thought that this was one of the key features of abduction narratives, was that people come back with a message that the world is in danger. Okay, so you can then have extraordinary experiences leading into a desire to participate in ecological activism or to create gardens and those kind of things. So I don't think it's like it's an either-or thing. It's a feedback loop, so you can kind of jump into it anywhere. You might have a spontaneous mystical experience or something, or a spontaneous paranormal event or a psychedelic experience or something, and then you come back from that and you feel an enhanced connection to nature, so you engage with the world. Or you might start off as a gardener or, a scientist or a botanist or whatever, and through your engagement with the world on a very practical scientific level, for example, you then have extraordinary experiences. So it doesn't matter where you come at it from, it's a feedback loop that you end up in, I think.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So talking about kind of people who are maybe a bit skeptical, I do think obviously there is a bit of a disconnect between those people who are sort of rooted in the scientific community and those who are maybe coming at it from a indigenous knowledge perspective. But it seems to me from reading the book that actually the end goal is the same. Everybody wants to stop the destruction of the environment, whether you are coming at it from a scientific perspective or a kind of a more, I don't know what the right word is, I suppose like an innate wisdom that people would have if they are more connected to the environment. But the end goal is the same. So where is the disconnect? Is there a way of getting those two polar opposites perspectives to work together to produce something that would be mutually beneficial all round?
Yeah, I definitely think that there is scope for, for example, collaboration between indigenous perspectives and science. And, there are people like Robin Wall Kimmerer who were working on making this kind of weave between indigenous worldviews and scientific worldviews, which I think is really important. But the other thing that we have to bear in mind as well is that there are also different motives going on. There is the science community, and the science community is agreeing that climate change is a big problem. There are the indigenous and spiritual communities, who are saying that this is a big problem. But then you're asking where the disconnect is, there are other motives as well. There is all of the money and industry and all of those kind of things that are going on, which, they move towards regardless of both the science or the spirituality. The motive is wealth, essentially. Mm. So I think that's probably part of where the problem lies. That our culture isn't based around, a scientific worldview, and it isn't based around a religious or spiritual worldview. It's based around an economic worldview. And that, I think, is part of the problem. Maybe even the big problem is that we don't see the world for what it is. We see it for, what it can do for us. This is something to do with the idea of, in deep ecology, they talk about intrinsic value. Everything is essentially equal. All living things have an intrinsic value. Whereas, from the mainstream kind of, I suppose we could call it capitalist point of view, everything has a value, not innate to itself, but for what it can do for human beings as a resource. And that is the kind of the main narrative that continues to drive ecological destruction.
So how could the embrace of the paranormal help us overcome that crisis? Can it,
Well, I think it's a part of it. I'm not saying that embracing the existence of spirits and all of those kinds of things will be a cure-all, and that all of a sudden, if people suddenly start to believe in the paranormal, that the ecological crisis will go away. But there is something about the paranormal, about the worldview that it reveals, of an interconnected cosmos inhabited by lots of different kinds of intelligence. Whether we're talking about extraterrestrial intelligences or nature spirits or, Bigfoot or Nessie or whatever. The idea is that there are lots of different kinds of minds. And we also have in the paranormal things like telepathy, psi, and those kind of things which suggest an interconnected, cosmos. So what I'm saying is that if we look at the paranormal and try to learn from some of these things, learn from it and what it can tell us about the nature of the world, then, we might move some step towards engaging with this kind of animistic idea, which, people like Theodore Rorschach said that animism has got a proven track record of, ecological stability. You can look at countless indigenous societies around the world. It's not to say that all indigenous societies have, lived in harmony with nature. There are instances where, ecological systems have been destroyed by indigenous communities, but many indigenous societies do have a harmonious, animistic relationship where they understand that they're living in relationship with other persons. And I think that the paranormal in Western societies is a remnant of that, and that if we can re-engage with it, then we might, we might be taking a step in the right direction.
A really big thank you to Jack for taking part in the interview. Please do check out his book, especially if you're a fan of books like Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass. My takeaway from the book is that we dismiss paranormal ecological experiences at our peril, and that it would be useful all round if we could stop thinking we have everything tied up in a nice rational bow. There's so much to learn if we could just let ourselves be receptive. Thanks to you for listening. This is the last episode of 2020. Thank you for your support and interest throughout the year. I appreciate everyone who's donated via GoFundMe and who supports me on Patreon. You are all amazing, and it's such a buzz to feel that there are people who believe in the podcast. I hope you all have a lovely Christmas and a happy New Year. I'll be back in mid-January for a whole new year of gardening audio goodies. I'll leave you with the final bug of the week for 2020, where Dr. Ian Bedford is talking about a bug that's particularly pertinent at this time of year.
If there's one tree that epitomises winter and the seasonal festivities, it has to be the holly. From its pagan roots, steeped in superstition, myth and magic, and its adoption by Christianity as a symbol of Christ's blood on a crown of thorns. Heralded as Britain's most common evergreen tree, though, holly's plentiful production of berries each year provides a valuable food source for many of the native bird and animal species that remain active during the bleakest months of the year. It is also the host of a small number of invertebrate species that rely on holly in order to complete their life cycles. None more so than the holly leafminer, a little fly that would almost certainly cease to exist without holly, as there are no other plant species that its larvae can feed on. Despite its host plant specificity, the holly leafminer is very common throughout Britain, and although it's unlikely that these tiny flies will be noticed when they're flying around at the end of spring each year, evidence that they'd laid their eggs on the holly trees will certainly become more apparent as the year progresses. Their eggs, positioned along the petioles of tender young leaves, soon hatch into tiny larvae that burrow into the leaf and begin feeding on the cells within the mid-vein. Throughout the summer months, they slowly work their way through the vein towards the tip of the leaf, and then, as winter approaches, they move out into the leaf blades, creating pale green transparent blotches as they mine their way through the leaf cells. Then, as temperatures continue to fall, the larvae become dormant, remaining inside the leaves until spring, when they'll resume feeding, pupate, and then emerge as the next generation of adult holly leafminer flies. Despite the leaf damage caused by
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website www.rootsandall.co.uk, where you'll also find my blog and a sign-up form for the newsletter, which gives you a weekly roundup of content, plus the inside scoop on things like upcoming guests. Or you can subscribe wherever you normally get your podcasts. Email me with comments and feedback at podcast@rootsandall.co.uk. Follow me on Twitter, Roots and All, Facebook, Roots and All UK, and Instagram, Roots and All Pod. But please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support my work, because if you like what I do, please help me to continue doing it. Even if you make a one-off donation of £1, trust me, it all helps, and I will be immensely grateful. So please go to Patreon and search for Roots and All.